Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology on Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Now that we've covered the relevant anatomy of the respiratory system, we can get into the physiology of breathing. What we're going to find is that the physiology of the respiratory system is really not that complicated. And probably, in my opinion, it's one of the easier systems in all of anatomy and physiology. You really just have a few things. You have to understand how breathing works, that is, inspiration and expiration. And then you have to understand how gas exchange works between structures called the alveoli and the blood. And there's a few other minor things, but overall it's a fairly simple system. And the initial part of this, which we're going to look at the mechanism of breathing, is all based on basic physics principles. And so before we actually look at the mechanism of breathing, we're actually going to talk about something called Boyles Law. Now, if you took a physics course or a thermodynamics course or even chemistry, you would have talked about something called Boyles Law. And it's a physical law that deals with pressure and volume as it relates to gas. Because think about it, all the air that we breathe in from the atmosphere, that's a gas, right? And so Boyles Law says P1V1 equals P2V2. P is pressure, V is volume. And so if we have some initial state, with an initial pressure and an initial volume, the product of those two things has to equal the final pressure times the final volume. Okay? And what this translates to in words is that an increase in volume always causes a decrease in pressure. The other thing that you also have to remember is that gas always effuses. Gas, we talk about effusing, not diffusing, but gas always effuses from high pressure to low pressure. It's the same concept as diffusion, high concentration to low concentration. Gas moves from high pressure to low pressure. But Boyles' law specifically deals with this first bullet point. So let's consider it. Suppose we have a container that begins at some volume V1. Okay, and let's say we increase it in volume to V2. Okay, then what's going to happen is the pressure in the container, P1, is going to decrease to P2. So if we increase the volume, the pressure is going to decrease. And so two key points come out of this, and they're basically just the reverses of each other, but they're both iterations of Boyles' law. When a container increases in volume, its pressure decreases. Okay? The second one, which is just the reverse, when a container decreases in volume, its pressure increases. And this is something very important to remember, especially when we talk about the respiratory system. So given this, let's consider that the container is the lungs. So if the lungs were to increase in size, meaning they expand, what happens to the volume of the lungs? Well, if they're expanding, then they're increasing in volume. And so what we would expect is the pressure inside the lungs to decrease. Right? Because if their volume's increasing, their pressure should decrease. That pressure inside the lungs we call the intrapleural pressure. That means the pressure inside the lungs. So when they expand, the pressure decreases inside the lungs. And this process, where the lungs increase in size, this is what we normally call inhalation, but generally when we talk about the respiratory system, we actually call it inspiration. Okay? Now, conversely, when the lungs decrease in size, meaning they compress, then the intrapleural pressure increases, because in this case, the lungs are decreasing in volume because they're compressing. And so in that case, the intrapleural pressure, that is the pressure inside the lungs, increases. This process we typically call exhalation, but in the context of the respiratory system, expiration. And I'm going to use these two terms, inspiration and expiration. But in layman's terms, inspiration means breathing in, expiration means breathing out. And really to understand any of the stuff on the following slides, you really should understand Boyles' law. Pressure and volume are inversely related. So in order to talk about breathing, we have to talk about some muscles and also the setup of the lungs. And the major muscle we're going to talk about is called the thoracic diaphragm. Most of the time you'll just hear it referred to as the diaphragm, but the full name is the thoracic diaphragm. While it doesn't look exactly like this, it's not a rectangle, this is going to be representing the diaphragm right here. And what we see is the diaphragm is situated beneath both of the lungs. So over here's the patient's left lung, and here's their right lung. Now if we look really carefully at each of these lungs, we see that there are pleural membranes, serous membranes that surround the lung. Remember, the pleural membrane on the surface of the lung itself is the visceral pleura, and then there's a superficial parietal pleura. And then just remember that there's a space between them, which we're not really going to talk about in this video, but it would be the pleural space or pleural cavity. Okay? Now, what's important to understand, even though I haven't really drawn it very well in this picture, is that the visceral and parietal pleuras are basically connected to one another. They don't appear that way here, but they are physically connected to each other. We'll talk about that in a later video, how that works. Okay? Also of note is that the thoracic diaphragm situated beneath the lungs is physically attached to the parietal pleura. Okay? It's attached to it. So, if we think about this, the thoracic diaphragm is attached to the parietal pleura, which is attached to the visceral pleura, which is attached to the lungs. Right? And so if something were to happen to the diaphragm, let's say it contracts, it's going to move the lungs, right? Or at least it's going to pull the lungs in a certain direction. So notice in the second picture over here, I've drawn the diaphragm contracted. When the diaphragm contracts, and we'll see this is what happens during inspiration, when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down, it pulls inferiorly. And so what that does is that essentially pulls the parietal pleura down, which then pulls the visceral pleura down, and then it pretty much just expands both lungs downward. So what you can see compared to this initial state, the volume inside the lungs increased. So whenever the diaphragm contracts, it pulls the lungs downwards. Although it doesn't pull the top downwards, it just pulls the bottom downwards. And the net result of that is the volume inside the lungs increases. Let's think about what that would do to the pressure inside each of these lungs. Well, if the volume's increasing, according to Boyles' Law, the pressure will decrease. And that leads us to talk about inspiration, which is the process of breathing in. All right, so let's start off with what atmospheric pressure is. Atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeters of mercury. That, of course, depends on where you are on the planet, but it can change. But we're going to use 760 millimeters of mercury for our reference. And before you inspire, before inspiration, notice the diaphragm has not contracted yet. The intrapleural pressure, that is the pressure inside the lungs, is approximately equal to the atmospheric pressure. So it's also 760 millimeters of mercury. So when both pressures are the same, nothing happens. Okay? Now let's inspire. Let's breathe in. You know how breathing in works? You can actually feel, if you breathe in hard enough, you can actually feel your lungs expanding. But what's happening at the diaphragm is it's contracting and pulling downward, as we mentioned on the previous slide. So what happens? The volume inside each of these lungs increases and the pressure decreases. That is, the intrapleural pressure decreases. The atmospheric pressure does not change. It's still 760 millimeters of mercury. You cannot change the atmospheric pressure. However, by inspiring and decreasing the intrapleural pressure, it will decrease to actually about 759 millimeters of mercury. Now, that doesn't seem like much of a difference, but 759 for intrapleural pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. Okay? And so, remember what I said. Gas always effuses from high pressure to low pressure. So, if the pressure in the atmosphere, 760, is greater than the intrapleural pressure, 759, gas will effuse from the atmosphere into the lungs. Okay? And that's why during inspiration, air moves into the lungs. Okay? You're not sucking in air. That's a misconception. You don't suck in air. All you do is you drop the pressure, that is the intrapleural pressure in the lungs, and then air spontaneously moves from high pressure to low pressure. So it moves from the atmosphere into the lungs itself. Okay? And that's because it's effusing down its pressure gradient from 760 to about 759. And so your lungs fill with air. Okay? That's the process of inspiration. And the major muscle that's involved in that is the thoracic diaphragm. Let's now look at the muscles of inspiration, and we're only going to look at what's called quiet or passive breathing in this video. Forced breathing we'll look at in the next video. For quiet breathing, this is basically just what you do when you're sitting watching TV. You're not even thinking about breathing. You're not exercising, you're not hyperventilating. You're just sitting there, probably watching this video, hopefully, quietly breathing. And when you're quietly breathing, there's only two muscles that play a role. One of them we just talked about was the thoracic diaphragm, and we mentioned that what it does is it pulls the pleural membranes downwards, it depresses them, and allows the lungs to expand inferiorly. But while you're quietly breathing, there's another muscle that also plays a role, or set of muscles, called the external intercostals. And what these muscles do is they actually lie between all the ribs, and they act to pull all the ribs superiorly. So they pull the ribs up. Okay? They don't deal with the sternum. There's some other muscles that deal with the sternum, but external intercostals actually pull the ribs upward. So not only can the thoracic diaphragm pull the pleural membranes downward to increase the volume of the lungs inferiorly, but by pulling the ribs upward, the external intercostals actually allow the lungs to expand a little bit upwards. Okay? Now, even though during quiet breathing we have both of these muscles at play, the thoracic diaphragm is by far the most important one of these. Okay? If you damage the nerve that innervates the thoracic diaphragm, which is the phrenic nerve, you are dead. Okay? But hopefully that makes sense. That's what quiet breathing is. Just sitting very quietly. You're not even thinking about breathing, but very gentle breathing. Only those two muscles are involved. Now let's talk about the reverse process, which is expiration. This is pretty much just the opposite. So we're going to begin with the lungs expanded. We're pretty much just picking up with the end of the last inspiration. So our lungs are already expanded, and at this moment right now, the intrapleural pressure is less than or equal to atmospheric pressure. That's what actually caused air to move into the lungs. But now during expiration, notice what happens with the diaphragm. It relaxes. Okay? So when it relaxes, it actually moves back up. And when the diaphragm moves back up, notice it's going to end up causing the lungs to recoil back to their original volume. Okay? So going from this state to this state, the lungs decrease in volume. And what do you think happens to the pressure inside the lungs? Well, the pressure is going to increase, because if the volume in the lungs is decreasing, the pressure has to increase. And so what will happen is actually the intrapleural pressure will actually rise above atmospheric pressure. Remember, you can't change atmospheric pressure. It is 760 millimeters of mercury. So when you expire and you bring the pressure back up, it's going to go up to about 761 millimeters of mercury. So therefore, inside the lungs, the intrapleural pressure will be about 761. Out here, it's going to be 760. And so according to that rule, gas always effuses from high pressure to low pressure. Gas or air will move from inside the lungs, where the intrapleural pressure is about 761, out into the atmosphere where it's 760. And that's how you expire. You're not really so much blowing out air, so to speak, but you're pretty much just causing the lungs to recoil back to their original size. So they're compressing, pressure increases, and that drives the air out. Okay. Now, if you look at this previous slide when we talked about inspiration, I put this oxygen here. Again, you're not just inspiring oxygen. There is CO2 in the atmosphere that you bring in, but what we'll talk about is that the process of inspiration later on is much more important for actually getting our body oxygen, because our body needs oxygen in order to live. On expiration, I put here CO2. Again, you're not just expiring CO2. You will inevitably expire a little bit of oxygen. But expiration, as we'll see, is very important for getting rid of carbon dioxide, because as we'll see, CO2, or carbon dioxide, actually is going to be a waste product that can actually cause acidosis if it builds up in the blood. Okay? Now with expiration, again, we're going to look at quiet breathing here. And what we're going to see is really just the mechanism of quiet expiration is pretty boring, actually. It's really just the relaxation of the two muscles we just talked about for quiet inspiration. So for quiet inspiration, it was really just contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostals. For quiet expiration, it's just relaxation of the diaphragm and relaxation of the external intercostals. And so let's think about what the relaxation does. Well, the diaphragm goes back to its original size, and kind of you go from this right here, it pushes the pleural membranes back up, and the lungs recoil back to their original size. When the external intercostals relax, they originally were pulling the ribs upwards, but when they relax, they allow the ribs to kind of go back down a little bit, and that depresses the thoracic cavity downwards from the top, and so that also acts to bring the volume of the lungs back to their original size. Okay? So with quiet inspiration, contraction of the diaphragm and external intercostals. For quiet expiration, they just both relax. Okay? When we look at forced inspiration and forced expiration, what we're going to see is that we're still going to have those two muscles, the external intercostals and the diaphragm, but we're going to see a whole bunch of other muscles that are going to contribute as well, because if we're doing forced breathing, then we're going to have to breathe with more force, and the way you get more force is you add more muscles. All right? So hopefully this video made sense to you and you understand a little bit about the mechanism of breathing. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.